Right, so this is Leviticus 12. Let me read first. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, if a woman conceives and bears a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days. As at the time of her menstruation, she shall be unclean. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Then she shall continue for 33 days in the blood of her purifying. She shall not touch anything holy, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purifying are completed. But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean 2 weeks, as in her menstruation. And she shall continue in the blood of her purifying for 66 days. And when the days of her purifying are completed, whether for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb a year old for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. And he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her. Then she shall be clean from the flow of her blood. This is the law for her who bears a child, either male or female. And if she cannot afford a lamb, then she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. And the priest shall make atonement for her, and she shall be clean. So, good news. This is the shortest chapter in Leviticus. So we will have a short Bible study. It deals with purification after childbirth, and it raises some very puzzling issues for modern readers. What can we learn from it? Well, it's so short, we don't need to skip over it. So we read it, and very simple. It says, if you are a woman and you bear a child, these are the instructions for you. Okay, first, a woman who has given birth to a son is unclean for 7 days, verse 2. But if you have given birth to a daughter, the period of uncleanness is 14 days. It says specific, verse 5, it says specifically that this is like the menstruation period, where which is mentioned in Leviticus 15. It hasn't come yet, we will read it. But when a woman, every month when a woman has a period until her menopause, she will have to do this every month. 14 days she is unclean. And after the first phase, that means after the 7 days for a son, 14 days for a daughter, the woman must wait another 33 days. If she has a son, she must wait 33 days, so a total of 40 days to be clean. And if she has a daughter, another 66 days added together, she is 80 days unclean. So looks like a very long period. And the son will be circumcised on the 8th day, verse 3. And we know this is because of God's covenant with Abraham in Genesis 17, verses 9 to 14. This is a covenant with Abraham that they will be God's people, and there will be a nation of priests. And God will bless everybody, will bless Abraham and bless everybody who blesses Abraham. So this is the promise to Abraham and his descendants. Then after the first phase, the 7 days for a son, 14 days for a daughter, verses 6 to 8 tells us that the woman was given birth. She shall bring, she shall take, okay, a year-old lamb for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or turtle dove for a sin offering. verse 6. I would put the words with sin in quotation marks because I want to say something about it. Most of the English translations use the word sin to translate the Hebrew word hatat. And I have talked about this before in previous lessons, especially the one when we talk about the sin offering, that actually this offering is not necessarily just for sin only. So one of the situations we have here is actually the offering being given to purify a woman from her uncleanness from birth. And verse 8 tells us if the woman is poor, she will be allowed to take 2 turtle doves. If she cannot afford a lamb, she can take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons as a burnt offering and a sin offering. So for us, the modern reader, there are 3 questions, and these are stumbling blocks for many non-Christians. They say if the Bible is from God, he doesn't seem to be a very forgiving God because he calls birth a sin. And the woman has sinned and she has to give a sin offering for giving birth. I will explain that actually sin offering is a misleading translation in this context. Secondly, why is the purification period doubled for a daughter? Is it because of prejudice against females, hostility, perhaps even a consideration that women are diminished in value, and that's why, you know, if you give birth to a daughter, you have to double your penalty. So these are the reasons why non-Christian reading this will say the Bible is not from God because it's so discriminating and so ignorant. Yeah, because why would menstruation be a sin, or why should it be dirty? You know, it's you got to clean yourself, so it's a dirty thing. So for a modern Christian, even I think some Christians read this and they get very puzzled, or maybe they say, "Oh, it's God's word. I shouldn't be questioning. I don't understand well. Too bad." As I say, actually, we can understand this and we can help other Christians and non-Christians to understand that what we see is not really what it means. Yeah, and let me explain some answers. We look at this passage and we see that God does not give Moses any reason why the days are doubled for a daughter. It's basically, just do it. It's my command. And the early Israelites probably wouldn't have asked, well, if it's God's command, I will do it. God says do this, I do this. God says don't do this, I don't do this. This is just simply the God who saved Israel and the God who I should obey, even if I don't understand. And this is what sometimes people say when God gives a command and we don't understand. But if we are clear it is God's command, we just do and have faith that everything will work out. So God does not give any reason why the day is doubled for a daughter, or even why there is a need for purification for childbirth and menstruation. And perhaps, you know, many non-Christians would say, see, that's why Christians look at sex and things like menstruation, which is a very perfectly natural human process. And Christians call this dirty, and they are so ignorant and so uneducated. And I don't want to have anything to do with such an ignorant religion. Okay, so these are reasons why we need to understand Leviticus 12 properly, and perhaps even Leviticus 13, 14, 15. Because there are many things that are considered unclean here, which to a modern person is, huh, really? Why is this unclean? So modern readers are puzzled by this chapter. And as I say, some non-Christians point out to such passages to say that God is ignorant, the Bible is ignorant, and God is a male creation. There is no such thing as God. God is created by the man to subdue and subjugate the women, to oppress them, or to devalue them. So because of this, they will not accept such a God. And I wouldn't accept such a God too. Is in this injustice, this is unfair, he is, you know, very, very unacceptable with this discrimination, if this is really what God means. So even though, as I said, the ancient Israelites probably did not question these requirements, we moderns do. And so we need to explain the correct meaning to critics and to ourselves. So here goes. First, I think we need to, as we do in all Bible study, look at the context. We look at the context of this passage, chapter 12. So we look at chapter 11, chapter 13, 14, 15 perhaps, and the whole Bible in context, and what the message of the whole Bible is, so that we can understand properly what this passage is or is not about. So we look at the context, the literary context, the context of the passage in the book, and we look at the context of history. What would these people have understood, and what would they be hearing when they hear Moses? So context of history, context of their culture. Of course, it's a very ancient culture and a very ancient language too. So sometimes we don't even understand the exact meaning of the word. So the translator would, as we say in Singlish, gasa, approximate, roughly, or try and make a guess as to what the meaning is. So as we mentioned in Leviticus 11, for example, there are many names of animals named there that we don't really know what they refer to. So the translators will make a guess and say, well, if we look at Israel, this animal is there in Israel, and the description seems to describe that animal. Yeah. So context of history, context of the literature, context of the culture and practices of Israel and the neighboring countries. Okay, so with that in mind, looking at the first context, we look at the whole Bible, and we know that sex and procreation is not a sin. Why? Because God commanded Adam and Eve to go forth and multiply. And that is in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, where after God creates heaven and earth and creates the man and the woman, Adam and Eve, he says, go forth and multiply. And this is a blessing. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, right? So there is this command by God to fill the earth. And verse 31, and God saw everything he had made, and behold, it was very good. So he pronounced his creation of Adam and Eve and the command to go forth and multiply and fill the earth as very good. So sex and procreation cannot possibly be bad in that sense. Giving birth is therefore obedience rather than disobedience. Sin is disobedience of God, but giving birth is actually an obedience to God's command to go forth and multiply in Genesis 1:28. So clearly it is not a sin. On top of that, if we read the Psalms, many other passages, and Israel considered having children as a blessing from God. And we read, for example, in the book of 1 Samuel, Hannah had no child, and she grieved and she mourned, and her husband tried to comfort her and said, no, silly man, he says, why don't you understand? My love for you is 10 times better than, the love of a son. And sometimes it is true as children, we give birth to them, and or the women, we give birth to them, and we spend all our heart and soul on them, and then when they grow up, they abandon us. And it's so painful. Why do you want to have children? Why do you consider that a blessing? But no, Israel considered children a blessing. Psalms 113 verse 9, 127 verse 3. We read this very clearly. So the Israelite did not look at childbearing as a burden, even if it is a command from God. So then, why is it unclean? Now, I've mentioned before in the discussion on the sin offering, so-called, I said it may not necessarily speak about sin as a moral wrong, as a disobedience of God's command, because we read in Leviticus 14 later that sometimes houses get mildew and they need to be cleaned. And so you go to the temple for the sin offering. But how can a house sin? It's not a person. There is no moral mistake when suddenly there is mildew on the walls and the roof and ceiling and whatever it is. So that cleansing would necessarily not be a physical cleansing. It's a ritual or a ceremonial cleansing. And therefore, even though the Hebrew word used here is hatat, which normally is translated sin, hatat here is simply the offering for purification. Sometimes it's for a real sin committed, but sometimes it's just simply for a event that is considered ceremonially unclean, and therefore it needs to be purified. So properly speaking, this is the purification offering and not a sin offering, and therefore childbirth is not a sin that needs to be forgiven. And neither is the word clean meant to be the opposite of dirty here. And that's a problem, right, for us modern readers of English. We look at the word clean and we think of dirt, we think of corruption and filth, and we go very puzzled because why is childbirth unclean? Yeah, maybe that's why, even in the advertisements, sometimes it seems to give this message to women as they sell the products, feminine products, they say, it's smelly, it's dirty, let us solve your problem here. And this could reflect human attitudes, but it would be totally unfair and unjust to blame the Bible for this attitude. It can be ignorance of the medical science, but certainly not because of the Bible. Because if clean and unclean here means dirt and no dirt, then there should be explicit commands on other things like excrement, yeah, feces and urine, because generally speaking, these could be disease carriers and they should be unclean. But the Bible says nothing about the fact that when we go to the toilet, we would be unclean and we need to cleanse ourselves before we go to the temple. Yeah, you clean yourselves by washing, but that's not a ceremonial washing. It is a physical washing. We need to clean up before we leave the toilet. So clean was meant to be ceremonial cleaners and not moral cleaners. And you had to be clean to go to the temple. You had to be clean to touch the holy things. For example, this peace offering, after you offer it to God, you eat it. But if you're unclean, you have to stay away from that peace offering meal, the feast. And generally speaking, then, the person who is unclean will be unable to go for worship, to enter the sanctuary, or to do anything related to the things of the temple and the ceremonies of the temple. And they cannot touch other people so that the other people can go to church, so to speak. So a clean person could worship in the sanctuary, touch holy things, and if you're unclean, stay away from touching people and things so that they don't get excluded from the sanctuary. And the explanation, as I said in previous studies, it's really God's using of daily physical examples to teach the Israelites to clearly distinguish between clean and unclean, between holy things and unholy things, so that they themselves would be a holy people in the land of Canaan, which is unholy. The other people were immoral, they were idolaters, and they did a lot of evil things. So when we look at the doubling of purification time for the birth of a girl, it certainly was not an effort to devalue women. And this is the explanation. Leviticus 11:39 tells us that if you touch a pig, the pig is an unclean animal, and touch it, you are unclean for 1 day. And how do you purify yourself? You wash and you stay away from temple and people until the evening. The Israelite considers 1 day as from evening to evening. Unlike for those in the West, we look at a day as beginning at 12 midnight and ending on 12 midnight. And in some cultures, like Chinese culture, in fact, we literally look at a day as daylight, and night is no daylight. So different cultures have different ways of counting the day. For the Israelite, it's evening to evening. So by evening, 1 day has passed, even if only a part of the day, but the evening has come, it's already 1 day. That's how they count 1 day. So if a pig is touched, you are unclean for 1 day. But if you touch a human corpse, because the corpse is dirty, is dead, you need to be unclean for 7 days. So if a lengthy purification time is meant to refer to a lower value, then the pig has a higher value than a human being, because you touch a pig, you only get unclean for 1 day, but you touch a human corpse, you are unclean for 7 days. So this kind of logic is wrong, right? Because obviously God created human beings as his highest creation, and he sent Adam and Eve to go and be stewards of the earth on his behalf. So the human being is of higher value than the pig. But because this is about ceremonial uncleanness and not about value systems, it doesn't mean that the pig is more valuable than the human being. Okay, so the number of days of cleansing, purification does not relate to God's conception of value of the human being. On top of that, we read Genesis 1:27, and we are told that God created human beings in his image, male and female, he created them. So in the same breath, God says, you, whether you're man or woman, you are created in my image. You're equal in my eyes, you're equal in value. You may have different roles and functions, and you may suffer different things, because after the fall in Genesis 3, we are told that the woman is cursed with childbirth. It's not really childbirth, it's the pain of childbirth, because for Adam, the man, he's cursed with pain in his toil, in his work, in his labor. So if you look at Genesis 3 carefully, the curse is not on work, the curse is not on childbirth. It is, you can do these things, these are things you will do. Men and women, we were created to do work, because in Genesis 2, before the fall, God gave work to Adam. He said, tend the garden, look after the garden. And he said, name the animals. And so that was work. Adam was the first biologist. And so we find that work is not cursed, childbirth is not cursed. It is that because of the fall, now the earth is separated from God, and pain and suffering would enter, and death would enter. Okay, so we need to read the Bible carefully. Men and women created equal in the image of God, and the curse is not on childbirth, but on the fact that there will be pain and suffering. And then here in Leviticus 11, verses 6 and 8, we see that the woman could enter the sanctuary herself. she is to take the offering into the temple and give it to the priest and say, please make this offering on my behalf. She didn't have to say, husband, go to the temple and make an offering for me, because I cannot enter the temple. I cannot enter the tabernacle. So please do it for me. No, God's word says she can go there herself. So she's an equal. She can go and make the offering. So while the length of purification time was different, if you read verse 6 carefully, you find that it says, and whether for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring them. Means the purification ritual, the animal that's given, the number of animals, everything is the same whether you have a son or a daughter. No discrimination. Doesn't mean that the daughter is lower value, so please bring more animals. The son is higher value, so you need to bring less. Or reverse, because it's a son and valuable, therefore bring in a valuable animal, but a daughter is not value, so please bring a pigeon. No, the pigeon is if you are poor, not because you have a daughter and she's a lower value, right? So you find that God's allowance of the pigeon or the turtle dove offering for a poor woman is because he's compassionate to her. He wants her to be able to discharge her duty and her Thanksgiving, perhaps, to give Thanksgiving herself with something that she can afford. So Israel particularly, I guess there would have been plentiful of pigeons. If you can't buy one, you go and catch one yourself. They're all flying around, yeah? So you don't need to be worried that as a poor woman, you have no way to come back into the sanctuary of God and worship him. And the ultimate joy, I guess, for a man and woman is to have communion with God. And if she was unclean, she could not approach God. Now, and it's not discrimination against the woman, because you find that the purification was needed not only for the woman's discharge of blood, but also for the man's discharge of semen in Leviticus 15. And we'll explore why in a short time, why there is a need to purify for discharge of blood and semen. And many theologians and commentators would say it's because it's a life and death issue. In Genesis chapter 9, God says to Noah, life is in the blood. Blood is the life of a person or animal, and if the blood is lost, the person or the animal dies. And so God says in Genesis 9:6, therefore do not take the life of another man. If you do, I will take your life in return. Okay, so the death penalty for killing life, because God is the author of life and death, not the human being. And the human being, if he takes it upon himself, he is not holy. He's trying to be God. He decides on life and death. Such a person has his life. So when we talk about blood, then blood is lost. It means that life is lost, and possibility, of course, is women can bleed to death. So even in childbirth, right? So it's very careful to look at life being stolen, being lost. And when life is lost, and the potential of life being lost, it means this is a person who needs to make himself right before God. And as for semen is life, right? The man's sperm goes into the woman's egg and life is born. And so if life is wasted, so to speak, is discharged, perhaps, young men, they have wet dreams and, sperm is spilled. It's not because it's a sin. It is because life has been destroyed. And so there is a need to clean this person who has been touching death, has touched death, and death is unclean, life is clean. And similarly, if you look carefully at the blood discharge of the woman after birth and during menstruation, we know that actually dead tissue, dead fetus is being discharged. Where the menstruation is concerned, maybe not dead fetus even, but sometimes it's just the egg is now not fertilized, and so it needs to be discharged. So it's about this sensitivity to life and death. And so when you have touched death, it's a reminder that Adam and Eve fell in Genesis 3 in the Garden of Eden, and we need to make atonement. And if you want to look at it as sin, it's atonement for the original sin of Adam and Eve to disobey God. So why does childbirth require purification? God's word doesn't explain, but because of the need of the modern person to hear an explanation, there are several reasons, good and bad, offered by theologians. And I think perhaps the more meaningful and perhaps more acceptable would be these two reasons. One, it has to do with blood. Blood is life and death. Blood, therefore, is a good cleansing agent, but blood that has death in it is unclean product. Death is unclean. The blood discharge, as I have mentioned earlier, contains dead tissues. So the loss of blood is symbolic of death. It's a symptom of death. And secondly, God's way of resting the woman who is weak after childbirth. It's actually, if God says, the woman is weak after childbirth, give her 80 days of rest, 6 weeks of unpaid leave or paid leave. And people would say, that's a bit long, right? So God has to give some reason for the woman to tell the man, hey, leave me alone. I'm unclean. Don't touch me. I need to rest. So why 80 days then for a daughter? Okay. I'll explain that in a short time for those who say this is God's way of protecting the woman and giving her rest because she's vulnerable at this time. And doesn't mean it's really the explanation of God, but it's a human explanation and it makes a little bit of a sense. Just as they say that when you look Leviticus 11, when we studied it, we said the certain animals are unclean, and perhaps it's actually God's way of protecting the vulnerable species. For example, the animal in the water that has no fin or scale. Well, if you have a fish, scales are a protection, but there's some, loosely speaking, fish like the shark and the eel. They don't have any scales. They are particularly vulnerable, not necessarily to predators, but vulnerable to disease and parasites and all that. So making them unclean actually is a way of protecting them, vulnerable species, from extinction by human hunting, perhaps. And slightly less credible, but still a reason to think of, is in giving longer protection and quarantine. Actually, it's a quarantine, 80 days quarantine for the mother and infant daughter. It's probably because God knew that human beings would value girls less. Not God. God doesn't value girls less, but human beings do. Whether it's Jewish culture or Chinese culture or Arab culture or any culture, perhaps not Western culture today. So the woman who is born, the girl who is born, she's going to have a lifetime of difficulty, and perhaps this long quarantine is to give the mother and daughter more time to bond so that they will be each other's support through life. And some would think that maybe this is a sort of a double purification time, because actually there are two women. One is an adult woman, one is a potential adult woman. Both of them, the two women who need to be protected, and so the time is doubled. and health and hygiene. If a woman is, to tell the Israelite society, this woman uh, needs protection, the quarantine is actually for her health and the baby's health. So stay away. And one way to explain it is to say this is an unclean period, don't touch her. Even the husband cannot have sex with her. She has got to be left alone for the full 40 days or 80 days. So health and hygiene could be one reason, and etc. etc. But it doesn't matter. I think the best reason for me is really it has got to do somehow with blood, life and death, the symbolism involved in that. So for us then, how does it apply to us? It again is this message, as we mentioned throughout Leviticus so far, God is teaching Israel to keep holiness and unholiness separate. Sin is defiling. Mixing with the unholy Canaanites is defiling. So stay away from them. Stay away by keeping yourself different, eat different things, do different things, dress differently. You are going to be distinctive from the people around you. And those of us who live in Toronto, we know that Jane and Finch area, right, where there are lots of Jews living there, it's so easy to identify a Jew walking past. You look at them and we know that's a Jew walking past, right? They've got this hat on and they've got long sideburns that are curly and and they dress in certain clothes. And on Saturday, they don't take a bus, they don't drive, and that's why they all live near Jane and Finch, right? Because there's a synagogue there and they can walk to the synagogue. They don't need to drive on Sabbath day. Yeah. So Israel continues to try to be different and distinctive. And so actually the code of holiness in Leviticus, one way of looking at it is, this is God telling Israel, I want you to be holy. And you know something? You think holiness is not attainable by human beings? Well, I am teaching you that holiness is attainable. And if you keep these rules, I will consider you in my grace, I will consider you clean. In other words, keep my commandments and you will be clean. So for us then as Christians, it is to daily remember to keep God's command, not because it will save us, but because we are saved to obey him and to spread his love to others. So that's holiness for us. It is attainable. And the other lesson we can learn is that God does not discriminate. No way. He says right from the beginning of the Bible, I've made man and woman equal. In status before God's eyes, in value before God's eyes, we are equal. Even if we have different bodies and functions and roles. And he gives us different rules in terms for, like, say, the holiness code. And note again that God is a compassionate God. And throughout the Old Testament, many times the prophets and the Bible talks about God being a loving God and a compassionate God. And he shows his compassion by providing for the poor. So if you have a rule that says lambs must be used for sacrificial ceremonies, then you cut off. This is not an inclusive rule at all. You cut off a lot of people who can afford a lamb. Even today, a lamb is very expensive. A lamb could probably feed 100 people. Even a small lamb could feed a lot of people. You know, if you think about them taking, a small portion each for a meal. And so God is compassionate. And you find that in the New Testament, in Luke chapter 2, verses 22 to 24, when Jesus was born, he was brought to the temple on the 8th day. The Jews would bring the children, the sons, for circumcision on the 8th day and name them. The name of the child is given on this 8th day ceremony. And modern eyes look at it medically would say the 8th day is actually a good day, because any earlier the child hasn't developed enough immunity for this surgery. It's actually a minor surgery, right? And that the 8th day is also before the child really begins to be very sensitive to pain. Mary, his mother, brought 2 turtle doves, we are told in this account. So she was poor, and so she came with 2 turtle doves, one for the sin offering, one for the purification offering, and one for the burnt offering. God today is still compassionate, whether we're poor or not, and especially if we are poor, I think God cares for us. That's all for today.